8 months pregnant, 12 degrees below zero, standing alone in a cemetery parking lot while her husband drove away with another woman in the front seat and his mother threw her overnight bag out the window onto frozen gravel. That was the worst moment of Claire's life. It was also the exact moment everything changed. Because what Ryan Bennett never knew, what no one knew, was that her quiet, barn coat-wearing father, who drove a beat-up Subaru and volunteered at the public library on Tuesday nights, had spent 30 years building something in complete silence. $4.2 billion. And every single cent of it had Claire's name on it. This is the story of a woman who was abandoned, humiliated, and legally attacked while in labor and still won. Not because she got lucky, but because someone who loved her had already built the walls before she knew she needed them. The people who truly love you don't wait for the world to confirm your worth, they build for it quietly, long before the storm arrives. This story will show you what real love looks like when it plans ahead and why the hardest chapters of your life are rarely the ending. They're the doorway. If this story moved you, drop a comment below, tell me which moment hit you hardest. Share this with someone standing in their own cold parking lot right now. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe and stay close. A new one arrives every week. It was the coldest February Vermont had seen in 40 years. The kind of cold that does not announce itself gently. It arrives in the night while you are sleeping and settles into the bones of the land. So that when you step outside in the morning, the cold does not feel like weather. It feels like a verdict. Claire Bennett had been standing in the parking lot of Maple Grove Cemetery for 3 minutes. She knew this because she had been counting. Counting was something she had taught herself to do over the last 3 years when she needed to stay anchored to something solid. 1 second at a time, 1 breath at a time. You keep counting until the feeling passes or until something changes. Something had changed. Her husband's car had turned the bend in the snow-covered cemetery road 1 minute and 40 seconds ago. She had watched the red taillights shrink and then disappear entirely around the curve of old oak trees that lined the path. She stood there until the sound of the engine faded, until the only sounds left were the creak of the cemetery gate in the wind and the soft mechanical groan of workers behind her. 2 men in green coveralls finishing the job of lowering her father's casket into the frozen Vermont ground. She did not turn to watch that part. She had said her goodbye before the service ended. She had pressed her palm flat against the dark wood of the casket and stood there with her eyes closed and her lips moving. Not quite a prayer, not quite a promise. Something between the two that belonged only to her and to him. Her overnight bag was at her feet. It had landed on the frozen gravel 2 minutes and 20 seconds ago. Tossed from the rear window of her husband's car by his mother, Patricia, who had powered down the glass with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. The clasp had popped open on impact. A travel bottle of hand lotion had rolled under the tire track. A small paperback her father had given her, with a handwritten note tucked between pages 47 and 48, had landed face down in the gravel with its spine cracked open and its pages filling with snow. Claire had picked everything up slowly, one item at a time. She did not rush. She had learned long ago that rushing was what certain people wanted from her, because rushing looked like panic, and panic looked like weakness. And there were people in her life who had built entire identities around the belief that she was weak. She was not weak. She was 8 months pregnant, standing barefoot on one side because her shoe had come off when she reached for the bag, wearing a black dress she had owned for 6 years and a wool coat that was working very hard against 12 degrees. And she was clearer in that moment than she had been in 3 years of marriage. Her right hand pressed flat against her stomach. The baby was still, probably sleeping, curled into whatever position a baby chooses in its final weeks before the world begins. Claire had been pressing her hand to her stomach like this for months without consciously deciding to. It had started one night in November when she could not sleep, and she lay in the dark and felt the reality of what was growing inside her and understood for the first time that whatever happened with everything else, whatever happened with Ryan and Patricia and Amanda Fowler and the marriage that had been coming apart thread by thread for 3 years, there was a person coming, an actual person, and that person was her responsibility before anyone else's. So she pressed her hand to her stomach and said silently, "I know you are here. I have not forgotten you. We are going to be all right." She was not entirely sure that was true yet, but she intended to make it true. Her other hand held a white envelope. She had carried it every day for 3 weeks. Since the afternoon her father pressed it into her hands in the guest room of his Burlington house, where the hospice nurse had set up a hospital bed near the window so Thomas Hartwell could see the garden he had planted and tended for 29 years. He had held the envelope out to her with a hand that trembled now, that same hand that had once fixed the engine on the old Subaru and built the bookshelves in the hallway and steadied her bicycle seat on the first morning she rode without training wheels. The trembling was new, the illness was fast and thorough and did not take requests. "Don't open this," he had said. "Until the world shows you what it needs to show you. You will know when. And when that moment comes, remember that everything I built was for you. Not for anyone who happens to be standing next to you. For you." She had taken the envelope. She had not asked what was inside, because something in his voice told her the answer would rearrange everything. And she was not ready to be rearranged while she was still needed in her current shape. Her name was written on the front in Thomas Hartwell's handwriting. He had the most beautiful handwriting she had ever seen on a man. Careful and even and unhurried. The handwriting of someone who believed that the things worth writing deserved the full weight of your attention. The envelope was still sealed. Behind her, the cemetery workers finished their task. She heard their voices briefly, low and professional. She heard a truck start up and drive quietly along the inner path. And then was only the wind and the snow and the particular silence of a place where people come to finish things. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text. "Mrs. Bennett, my name is James Whitmore. I have been trying to reach you for several days. I was a close associate of your father for 25 years. I was present at the service this morning. I saw what happened in the parking lot. Your father asked me to be here today. Please do not leave. I am 4 minutes away." She read the message once, then again. She knew the name. Her father had mentioned James Whitmore exactly 3 times in her entire life. Always briefly. Always with a kind of respect he reserved for very few people. The last time was 2 years ago, sitting on the porch of the Burlington house with his coffee going cold, because he kept forgetting to drink it while he talked. He had said, "If anything ever happens to me, James will find you. Let him." She had thought at the time it was the kind of thing a parent says when they are beginning to reckon with their own mortality. She had filed it gently away with the things she was not ready to examine. She put the phone back in her pocket. She picked up her overnight bag, brushed the snow from the paperback, tucked it carefully inside, and walked back through the cemetery gate to the wooden bench near the path. She sat down. She could see her father's grave from here, the dark mound of fresh earth against the white ground. The flowers from the service, their colors already softening in the cold. The plain granite marker Thomas had selected and paid for years in advance, because he was the kind of man who handled his own arrangements so his daughter would not have to. She placed her hand back on her stomach. The baby shifted once, a slow rolling movement. "I know," Claire said quietly. "To no one and to everyone, I know." 4 minutes later, a black sedan came through the cemetery gate and stopped on the path. A man in a dark overcoat stepped out, silver-haired, 60 years old. He moved with the steady bearing of someone who has known for a long time exactly where he stands and why. His eyes, when they found hers, were kind and direct, and they carried something that looked unmistakably like relief. He had been holding something for 25 years. He was finally allowed to set it down. He walked toward her through the snow and said, "Mrs. Bennett, I am deeply sorry for your loss. Your father was one of the finest people I have ever known." He paused. "He loved you more than anything he ever built, and what he built was extraordinary. I need you to understand that before I say anything else." Claire looked at him steadily. "How extraordinary," she said. James Whitmore took a breath. "I think we should find somewhere warm," he said. "What I need to tell you will take a little while, and you should not be standing in the cold." She stood. She picked up her bag. She followed him to the car, and the rest of her life began. To understand what happened in that cemetery parking lot, you have to go back further than the marriage. Further than the day Claire met Ryan Bennett at a law school mixer in her second year and mistook his volume for depth. You have to go back to a farmhouse on the outskirts of Burlington, Vermont, to a vegetable garden in the side yard, and a cracked Davard Subaru in the gravel drive, and a man named Thomas Hartwell, who wore the same patched barn coat every winter from October through March and never once complained about the cold. Thomas was the kind of man that most people liked without being able to explain why. He was not loud. He did not tell stories that required an audience. He did not fill a room with presence the way some men do, the way Ryan Bennett would later do. That particular kind of loudness that announces itself before you arrive and lingers after you leave. Thomas Hartwell was something rarer. He was the kind of man you felt calmer around, the kind whose silence did not demand to be filled, the kind who, when he asked how you were doing, was genuinely listening for the answer. He volunteered Tuesday evenings at the Burlington Public Library, helping adults learn to read. He had done this for 14 years. He was careful to arrive before his students and to stay after they left, so that nobody would feel like they were keeping him. He remembered their names and the names of their children and the small victories that marked their progress. He celebrated these victories without making them feel small by celebrating too large. He mowed the elderly neighbor's lawn on the left side without being asked. He fixed his own roof. He drove the Subaru until it needed a new transmission, then had the transmission replaced because he said it was a good car and there was no reason to give up on a thing simply because one part had worn out. The people of his neighborhood thought he was a retired school administrator, some thought insurance, or maybe a pension from a government job somewhere. Nobody pressed because Thomas Hartwell never offered, and there is a kind of person whose privacy is so natural, so undefended that it never occurs to anyone to question it. Thomas Hartwell was none of those things. He was the sole founder and controlling owner of Hartwell Capital Partners, a private investment firm operating across commercial real estate, energy infrastructure, and technology holdings in 18 states and 3 international entities. The firm had been built over 30 years through a structure of family trusts, holding companies, and legal arrangements so carefully layered that Thomas's name appeared in 0 public documents. No press releases, no magazine profiles, no conference keynotes, no charitable galas where the donor's name was read aloud over a microphone. $4.2 billion, built in complete silence, by a man in a barn coat who drove a Subaru and went to bed most nights before 10. He had built it this way on purpose. Thomas had watched what money did to families. He had seen it with his own cousins, who had inherited a modest real estate portfolio from their grandfather and spent the next decade in litigation with each other. Not over the money itself, but over what the money meant, over who deserved more, over the ancient childhood arithmetic of love that gets applied to everything when there is something to divide. He had seen how the children of his wealthiest clients moved through the world, the particular hollow confidence of people who had never had to earn the ground under their feet, the way they confused ownership with worth, the way they had difficulty trusting that the people who loved them, and not what they represented. He did not want that for Claire. So when she was born, when he held her in the hospital in Burlington on a Tuesday morning in April, and she looked up at him with the ancient, unimpressed expression that newborns have, as if they have seen many worlds and are reserving judgment on this one. Thomas Hartwell made a decision that most people who learned about it later said they could not understand. He decided to raise her without the money, not without love, not without education, without the weight. Claire grew up making her own lunches on weekday mornings, peanut butter and apple slices and whatever was left from dinner the night before. Packed in a paper bag she folded down at the top. She worked summers starting at 15, first at the garden center in town, then at the county library reference desk, then at a legal aid office in Burlington where she filed documents and answered phones, and started to understand that the law could be a tool for protection or a weapon depending on whose hands were holding it. She applied to law school herself. She researched the programs, wrote the applications, took the prep courses from library books, because Thomas said a prep course you taught yourself stuck better than one someone else taught you. She got into a good school in Boston. She got a partial scholarship. She took out loans for the rest. And Thomas did not write a check or make a phone call or pull a single string. He let her feel the full weight of the world, because he believed that was how you found out what you were made of. She graduated 3rd in her class. She took a position at a legal aid nonprofit in Boston, housing court work, helping families fight eviction and negotiate with landlords and understand the documents they were being asked to sign. She made $52,000 a year, and she was proud of that with a specific, earned pride that has nothing performative in it. The pride of a thing you actually did yourself. On Sunday mornings, when Claire came home to Burlington, Thomas would make coffee in the kitchen while she sat at the table with her feet tucked under her, the same way she had sat since she was 8 years old. And they would talk about her cases, about the families she was helping, about books they had both read, about the hawks that circled the field at the edge of the county, which Thomas had been watching for 20 years with a particular admiring patience. Sometimes they would drive out to that field in the old Subaru and sit on the hood in the early morning quiet and watch the hawks. And Thomas would talk to Claire about what he believed, about integrity as a daily practice rather than a declaration, about the difference between power and goodness, which he had found in 30 years of building a company was a very large difference and one that most powerful people never quite grasped, about the fact that the people who loved you for what you had could always leave, but the people who loved you for who you were would find reasons to stay. He did not tell her about the company, not directly, not ever. The only clue that something larger existed was a man named James Whitmore, who arrived once a year in a black sedan and stayed for exactly 2 hours in Thomas's study with the door closed, and who left without ever staying for dinner, which Thomas always offered and James always politely declined, as if staying for dinner might complicate something he needed to keep uncomplicated. When Claire was 12, she asked who James was. Thomas said, "He is the man who keeps his promises." She had not asked again. The envelope had existed since Claire was 19. She had seen it once, briefly, when Thomas's desk drawer was left open and she was looking for a pen, a white envelope, her name written on the front in his careful handwriting. She had reached for it without thinking, and Thomas had come into the room at that moment and gently, without alarm, without scolding, had taken it from her and put it back in the drawer. He had said, "Not yet, baby girl. That one is for later, for the day when you need to know exactly who you have always been." She had understood this, in the way that children understand things their minds cannot yet fully carry, as a kind of promise made across time. She would understand it fully at a fire-warm table in a Vermont inn, at 8 months pregnant, on the afternoon of her father's funeral. But first, she would have to live through the years that came between. Claire met Ryan Bennett in the fall of her second year of law school, at a mixer hosted by the Campus Law Review in a downtown bar with exposed brick and craft beer on tap, and the particular atmosphere of ambitious 20-somethings performing their best versions of themselves for each other. Ryan was performing better than almost everyone else in the room. He was tall, well-dressed without looking like he was trying to be, and he had a kind of social energy that made the people around him feel like they were part of something. He was funny in the sharp, quick way that plays well in groups. He had strong opinions delivered with enough confidence to seem like expertise. He was the kind of person who knows how to make you feel, in the first 5 minutes of meeting them, like you are the most interesting person they have spoken to all evening. Claire, who had spent her life around a man who was exactly the opposite of all these things, found it intoxicating. She would later understand that she had confused volume for depth, and that these two things look identical from a distance, but are nothing alike up close. But she was 24, and he was charming, and she had spent the last 2 years in Boston working very hard and not doing much else. And Ryan Bennett was right there, laughing at something she said with his whole face, looking at her like she was someone he intended to know better. They dated for a year. They moved in together the summer after she graduated. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony in Burlington, in a restored farmhouse on the edge of the county, with Thomas in the front row and James Whitmore, quietly, in the third row at the end. Thomas had sat through the ceremony with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on Claire the entire time, watching the way a man watches a ship leave the harbor, with love and concern in equal measure. He had shaken Ryan's hand at the reception and said he was glad to meet him and looked forward to getting to know him. And Ryan had said the right things and smiled the right way, and Thomas had been polite and warm and had not said what he was thinking. He never told Ryan about the money. He had asked Claire not to either. "Let him love you for who you are," Thomas had said. "If he can do that, then he deserves to stand beside you. If he cannot, the envelope will tell you what to do next." Claire had kept that promise. She had never told Ryan anything about Hartwell Capital Partners, about the money, about any of it. Not because she was hiding something, but because she wanted the kind of marriage where the person across from you chose you and only you, not what you might represent or provide or become. She wanted to be certain. She would become certain, just not in the way she had hoped. The marriage did not collapse all at once. It eroded, the way a riverbank erodes, slowly and then suddenly, the way you do not notice the ground is softer beneath your feet, until one morning you look down and there is nothing solid left. Ryan had taken a position at a mid-sized financial firm in Boston. It was a good job by most definitions. Steady income, professional trajectory, the kind of title that sounds impressive at dinner parties. But Ryan did not want a good job by most definitions. He wanted the life he had seen from the outside his whole life. The Manhattan apartment with the building doorman, the summer house somewhere with a name people recognized, the driver, the watch, the table at the restaurant where the reservation takes 3 weeks. He had grown up in Ridgefield, Connecticut, comfortable but not wealthy. His father had built houses for a living, good honest work that Ryan was embarrassed by the time he was 15. His private high school, which his parents had stretched to afford because they believed in him and they wanted him to have opportunities they had not had put him in classrooms with boys whose families owned things, not just comfortable things. Old things, houses with histories, names on buildings. The kind of wealth that has been there long enough to forget it arrived. Ryan had sat in those classrooms with identical grades, sometimes better, and watched the doors that opened for those boys when the right person walked through the room. He had developed by the time he was 17, a very specific and very permanent understanding of the difference between being near wealth and having it. And that understanding had shaped everything that came after, including what he did to Claire. The cruelty started small, it almost always does. Comments at his firm's dinner events about how she did not know how to work a room, suggestions delivered as observations, that her nonprofit work was admirable, but not exactly the kind of thing that helped his career advancement. A look when she mentioned her salary that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. a habit of redirecting conversations at parties away from her nonprofit cases and toward the work he was doing, as if her work was something to move past rather than something to celebrate. Then Patricia arrived. Ryan's mother had been living with her sister in Hartford, but after a disagreement about money, which was the reason Patricia Bennett had disputes with everyone eventually, she appeared at their apartment door one October evening with two large suitcases and an attitude that Claire would later describe to Sarah as the most efficient system for destroying a household she had ever witnessed. Ryan had not discussed it with Claire. He had simply told her his mother was staying. She should make up the guest room. Within 2 weeks, Patricia had reorganized the kitchen cabinets, replaced the grocery list, criticized Claire's cooking, her cleaning, the way she folded towels, the amount of time she spent on work calls in the evening, and the fact that she had not yet become pregnant. "I do not know what my son saw in you. Honestly," Patricia said one Sunday evening at dinner, loud enough for the upstairs neighbors to have heard through the ceiling, while Ryan sat across the table and said absolutely nothing. Not one word, not a single correction or defense. He looked at his plate and cut his food and said nothing. That silence told Claire everything she had been trying not to know for months. She was alone in this marriage. Ryan had already left. He had simply not moved out yet. Then came Amanda. Amanda Fowler joined the research division of Ryan's firm in the spring. She was 30 sharp, fluent in every social register. And she had come from old money in the particular way that means the money has been there long enough to look effortless. Her grandfather had founded a regional bank. Her father sat on corporate boards. Her apartment in the Back Bay was paid for by a trust her grandmother had established. She wore the right things and knew the right people and moved through professional Boston the way people move through spaces they own. She was in Ryan's precise internal calculation, the access he had been working toward his entire adult life. Amanda was not a person to him, she was a door. He began the affair with a coldness that Claire would only understand fully later. When James Whitmore laid the timeline out in front of her in his office, it was not passion, it was positioning. Every dinner he did not come home from, every business trip that extended by a day, every text message he stopped bothering to hide because he had stopped caring whether Claire saw it. And then Amanda began appearing in their home. First for a Saturday brunch, then for Sunday evenings, then occasional weekends, staying in the guest room that Patricia had claimed as her own, while Claire stood at the stove in her own kitchen and watched her husband pour 2 glasses of orange juice and bring both to the table and come back for his own coffee without once looking in her direction. She had become invisible in the house where she paid half the mortgage. One evening, Ryan said it plainly. They were at the dinner table. Claire had cooked for 2 hours. Nobody thanked her. Patricia was talking to Amanda about a weekend trip they were apparently planning together. Ryan was on his phone. Without looking up, he said, "My father always said you could tell what a woman was worth by what she brought to the table. You have been at this table for 6 years, Claire, and I am still trying to figure out what that is." Patricia did not look up either, but the corner of her mouth moved. Claire set down her fork. She pushed her chair back. She left the room without a word. She went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and held the white envelope against her chest, the one she had carried in her bag every single day since Thomas had given it to her. She did not open it. She was not ready. But something had shifted. Something that had been patient and patient and patient had reached the edge of its patience and was now simply waiting for what came next with a different quality. Not hope anymore, something harder than hope, something that did not need to be told it would survive because it already knew. Thomas Hartwell was diagnosed in October. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The oncologist in Burlington was thorough and honest and used the word aggressive, which is a word that carries its meaning very efficiently. There would be treatment to manage symptoms. There would be no treatment to cure the disease. They were talking, he said with the careful kindness of someone who has delivered this news many times, about time, how to spend it, what mattered and what did not. Thomas listened to the oncologist with the focused attention he brought to everything, asked 3 precise questions, thanked the doctor for his directness, and then drove himself home in the Subaru and sat in the garden for an hour in the late afternoon light before going inside to call Claire. She was in Boston when her phone rang. She was between hearings at housing court, standing in the hallway with her coat over her arm and her case files under the other. She heard her father's voice, and she heard the particular quality of it, and she knew, before he said a single word about a diagnosis or a doctor, that something had permanently changed. She drove to Burlington that Friday. She would drive to Burlington every Friday after that. Ryan came once. He sat in the corner of Thomas's guest room for 45 minutes with his phone angled, so Thomas could not see the screen, but Claire could. And he had excused himself for a client call that did not exist and waited in the car for an hour. and then came back in and said he thought they should probably head back tonight instead of tomorrow morning because he had something early. Thomas had said it was very good of him to come. He had meant it kindly. He was that kind of man. Claire walked Ryan to the car. He might not be here next month. She said, not accusatory, just a fact. Ryan said, I will try to be more available. He got in the car. He did not come back. The Fridays passed. November. December. The drive north on Route 89 with the winter beginning, and the hills going gray and bare, and the sky the particular flat white of New England in the late fall. Claire would arrive in the early evening, and her father would be sitting up in the hospital bed that the hospice team had set up in the guest room. Books stacked on the nightstand, the garden visible through the window, and he would look up when she came through the door with an expression she would carry the rest of her life. The expression of someone who was running out of time and was spending whatever was left on the things that were worth spending it on, and who had already made his list, and she was at the top of it. They talked. They read together the way they always had, trading books back and forth, sometimes reading aloud to each other. He asked her about her cases. He asked about the baby. He was the only person in her life who asked about the baby with genuine curiosity, and not as a subject connected to Ryan or to the marriage or to any of the other complicated things surrounding it. Tell me what you think she will be like, he said one December evening, and Claire had said, I think she will be stubborn, and Thomas had said, good. Stubborn is useful, and they had both laughed, and it was real, and for a few minutes neither of them thought about anything except the person on the way. In the last week of December, Thomas asked to speak with her alone. James Whitmore was already there, standing by the window with his hands behind his back in his characteristic posture, watching the snow fall on the garden. Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. His body had thinned, his hands lay still on the blanket, but his eyes were clear, the same eyes that had watched hawks circle over the county field for 20 years. The eyes of a man who had built an empire in 30 years of careful quiet and had never once lost himself inside it. He reached under his pillow and drew out the white envelope. Open this when you are ready, he said. When they have shown you everything. When there is no more pretending. He pressed it into her hands. You will know the moment. And when it comes, you will know exactly who you have always been. She took the envelope. She pressed her forehead against his. He closed his eyes and smiled. A small, tired smile that held 28 years of a love that had never once needed to announce itself. 2 days into the new year, on a Tuesday morning with snow falling softly on the garden, Thomas Hartwell closed his eyes and did not open them again. James Whitmore called Claire at 6:45. She was already in the car. She drove the 4 hours to Burlington with the white envelope on the passenger seat, and her hand pressed to her stomach in the kind of grief that is too large to cry because it does not fit through the opening that tears require. She drove through the mountains and the white silence of the Vermont winter, and she arrived at the Burlington house as the morning was just getting light, and she sat in the parked car for 10 minutes before she could make herself go inside. Then she went inside, and she began the arrangements, because that is what you do, and because there was no one else to do them, and because Thomas Hartwell had raised a daughter who could do hard things even when she did not want to. The morning of her father's funeral, Claire stood in the bathroom of the hotel room she had booked near the cemetery, 36 weeks pregnant, her ankles swollen from the drive and the standing and the last 6 months of everything, a grief that had settled in her chest like a stone she could not put down. She had laid her black dress out on the bed before she got in the shower, the same black dress she had worn to her own wedding 7 years ago, not the best dress she owned, the one that had the most Thomas Hartwell in it, because he had been present for both occasions, and she wanted something that connected the 2 days. She came out of the bathroom in her robe. Ryan was at the mirror in his good suit, fixing his collar. Amanda Fowler was sitting on the edge of the bed, in Claire's room, in a black dress she had clearly chosen with some care for the occasion. Claire stood in the bathroom doorway and took in the entire picture, her husband, his girlfriend, her dead father's funeral, her 36 weeks pregnant body in a hotel bathrobe, Amanda reaching for the complimentary coffee on the nightstand without looking up. She made a decision in that doorway that she would think about for years afterward. She had made it before she was fully conscious of making it. She decided that she was not going to give either of them the reaction they perhaps expected, or perhaps feared, or perhaps had not thought about at all because neither of them had yet arrived at the point of seeing her as a person whose reactions needed to be considered. She went to the closet and took out her black dress and her coat and her shoes. She got dressed. She picked up the white envelope from the nightstand and put it in her coat pocket. She got in the back seat of the car. The 40-minute drive to Maple Grove Cemetery passed with Amanda in the front passenger seat and Ryan driving, and the radio turned up, and a conversation between the two of them in the front seat that occasionally produced a laugh. And Claire sat in the back with her hand on her stomach and looked out the window at the Vermont winter and said nothing. At the cemetery, the service was small. The minister had known Thomas from the library volunteers program and spoke about him with genuine warmth. A few neighbors who had known Thomas for years sat in the folding chairs on the frozen ground and wept without apology. A woman named Margaret, who had brought Thomas food during the first winter after Claire's mother passed, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and rocked slightly in her chair. Ryan stood 6 feet from Claire and spent the service checking his phone with the screen angled down at his side, as if that angle made the checking less visible. Amanda stood beside him. Patricia, who had driven separately, stood on Ryan's other side in dark glasses that had nothing to do with the gray February sky. The minister finished. Claire stepped forward to touch the casket one last time. She pressed her palm against the wood and she whispered what she whispered, and it belonged to no one else, and she meant every word of it. Then she turned toward the parking lot. Ryan was already at the car. Amanda was in the passenger seat, adjusting something in the visor mirror. Patricia was opening the rear door. Claire walked toward the car. She reached for the other rear door handle. Ryan stepped between her and the door. "There is no room," he said. She looked at him. "Ryan, there is no room. Amanda's riding with us. You can call a car service." 12 degrees, snow beginning, 8 months pregnant. Her father's casket still visible behind her. "I am carrying your child," she said. He did not answer. He opened Amanda's door. Amanda did not look at Claire. Ryan walked around to the driver's side. The rear window came down. Patricia's face appeared in the opening. "Here you are, sweetheart," Patricia said, and dropped Claire's overnight bag onto the frozen gravel. The bag hit the ground, the clasp popped. The paperback fell open in the gravel. "Fresh air will do you good," Patricia said, and the window went up. The car moved. Claire stood in the parking lot and watched it go. She stood there until the sound of the engine was gone, and the only sounds were the wind and the gate and the workers and the particular silence of having just been shown, with absolute clarity and no remaining room for doubt, exactly who the people around you are. She had not screamed. She had not chased the car. She had stood very still, and she had understood. She bent down slowly and picked up the bag. She walked back through the gate to the bench inside the cemetery. She sat down. She pressed her hand to her stomach and she said, to her daughter, to her father's grave 30 yards away, to whatever was listening in the cold Vermont air, "It is just us now, little one, and that is enough." Her phone buzzed. She read the message from James Whitmore. She read it twice. She put the phone in her pocket. She sat on the bench in the snow and she waited with the particular stillness of someone who has finally, after a very long time, nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. 4 minutes later, the black sedan came through the gate. James Whitmore drove her to a small inn on the edge of Millbridge, 7 minutes from the cemetery. It was the kind of place Thomas Hartwell would have liked. Wide plank floors, low ceilings, a fireplace in the corner of the dining room that was doing serious, effective work against the February cold. The woman at the front desk took one look at Claire's condition and her expression and brought tea without being asked. They sat at a corner table near the fire. James set his briefcase on the floor beside him and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the direct, kind steadiness she would come to know well over the following months. "First," he said, "I want to say something on your father's behalf, because he asked me to say it in person if I ever had the chance. Thomas Hartwell watched you become the person you are with more pride than he could ever put into words. He told me once that you were the best thing he had ever built, and he used that word deliberately. Built, not had, not raised, built, because he thought you were a construction as much as a birth, that you were made of choices as much as circumstances, his and yours." Claire looked at the fire. She did not speak. James opened his briefcase. "Your father's estate has cleared preliminary legal review," he said, "as his sole heir and the sole beneficiary of the Hartwell family trust, which he modified and finalized 12 years ago. You are now the legal owner of Hartwell Capital Partners and all associated holdings and subsidiaries." He laid a document on the table in front of her. "The current valuation of those holdings, as of last quarter's independent audit, is $4.2 billion. Claire looked at the document. She looked at him. $4.2 billion, she said. "Yes. My father. Your father." She sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. Someone in the kitchen dropped something metal and picked it up. Outside the window, the snow was coming down steadily now over the parking lot and the road and the old maples that lined the main street of Millbridge. "He never said a word," she said. "He was very deliberate about that," James said. "I can explain the structure if you want the full detail. The holding companies, the trusts, how the firm is managed, all of it. But I think there may be something you want to do first." He looked at her coat pocket, where the edge of the white envelope was visible. Claire reached into her pocket. She took out the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment. She thought about the last 3 weeks, about the parking lot, about Ryan's face when he said there was no room, about Patricia's smile through the window, about Amanda sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with her coffee, unbothered. She thought about what her father had said, "You will know when." She ran her thumb under the flap. Inside was a single handwritten letter on thick cream paper, folded into thirds, and a key. A heavy old-fashioned key with a tag attached. Hand-lettered, Main House, Burlington. She unfolded the letter. Her father's handwriting, steady and unhurried, and even here, at the end of everything, completely itself. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then 2 things have happened. I am gone, and the world has shown you what it needed to show you. I am sorry for both, but I am not sorry for how I raised you. I gave you something before the money. I gave you the ability to see people clearly. Not everyone can do that. Most people spend their whole lives wanting so badly to believe the best about the wrong people that they never see clearly at all. You see clearly, you always have. That is your inheritance before the inheritance. The money is just the rest. Use it wisely, use it gently. Never let anyone make you forget that you were worth everything long before the world found out. I love you completely. I always will, Dad." She read the letter twice. She folded it. She placed it back in the envelope. She held the envelope in both hands on the table, and she looked at the fire, and she let herself cry, fully, without managing or containing it. The way she had not let herself cry since the morning James had called to tell her Thomas was gone. The grief came out of her in waves. The way real grief does when you stop trying to hold it to a manageable size. The enormous grief of missing a man who had loved her with a consistency and a depth that she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of. James sat quietly across the table and did not fill the silence with words. He understood that this was not a moment that needed filling. When she was finished, she pressed the envelope flat on the table with her palm and looked up at him with red eyes and a steadiness in her expression that had not been there before. "Tell me everything," she said. "The structure, the holdings, all of it. I want to understand what I have." James opened his briefcase. "Then we should order more tea," he said, "because this will take a while. And here is the first thing worth pausing on. In this moment, sitting by that fire with $4.2 billion just having been placed in her name, Claire Hartwell Bennett did not think about Ryan. She did not think about what Ryan would say when he found out, or what his face would look like, or what the news would do to the people who had decided she was worth nothing. She did not think about vindication or revenge or any of the emotions a person would be entirely entitled to feel in that moment. She thought about her father. She thought about Sunday mornings on the hood of the Subaru watching Hawks. She thought about a man in a barn coat who had built $4 billion in silence because he believed, with his whole heart, that the most important thing he could give his daughter was not what he had. It was who she was before she knew what he had. That distinction, the thing he gave her before the money, is the thing worth sitting with. Because here is the question, and it is a question worth carrying past this story and into your own life. What are you giving the people you love before you give them what you have? Thomas Hartwell's answer was 28 years of exactly who he was, every single day, without reservation. And it was enough. It turned out to be more than enough. It was everything. She did not tell anyone publicly, not for 3 weeks. She moved into the Burlington property the day after the funeral. The main house was a federal-style brick building on 14 wooded acres on the north side of Burlington, set back from a private road behind a low stone wall. Thomas bought the land 22 years ago and built the house over 3 years, making most of the design decisions himself, choosing wide hallways and high ceilings and a library that ran the full length of the back of the house, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and 2 armchairs that faced the garden window, and between them a small table where Thomas had kept his coffee cup and his reading glasses and his copy of whatever history book he was in the middle of. The staff had worked for Thomas for years. A groundskeeper named Walter, who was 64 and had worked the property since it was built. A housekeeper named Ruth, who had managed the house for 15 years and who, when Claire walked through the front door carrying her overnight bag, took one long look at her and said, "He told us you were coming. We are very glad you are here," and then went to make soup, because Ruth dealt with every difficult thing in life by first establishing that there was something warm to eat. James came every morning for the first week. He walked Claire through the structure of the company, the names of the division heads, the current holdings, the trust documentation, the accounts. He was patient and precise and never made her feel rushed, which she appreciated because there was a great deal to understand and she intended to understand all of it. She called Sarah on the second day. Sarah Caldwell had been Claire's closest friend since their first year of law school, when they had been assigned adjacent study carrels and had started trading books and then started going to the same coffee shop and had been in each other's lives with the reliable constancy of genuine friendship ever since. Sarah was now a partner at a litigation firm in Boston. She was sharp and funny and deeply loyal, and she had told Claire, exactly twice in the last 3 years, that Ryan Bennett was not the person Claire deserved. And when Claire had defended Ryan both times, Sarah had said only, okay, and let it go, which is what a person does when they love someone enough to wait. Sarah drove to Burlington the morning after Claire called and arrived at the main house at noon with 2 bags of groceries and said not a single word about Ryan or the estate or the $4.2 billion until Claire brought it up herself. Because Sarah understood that the most important thing Claire needed from her in that moment was not information or advice or reaction. It was simply her presence. They sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning, talking about Thomas, about the baby, about what the next months might look like, about a funny case Sarah had recently argued and a movie Claire had been meaning to see for 6 months. They ate the soup Ruth had made, and then crackers and cheese, and then ice cream from the freezer because Sarah said that grief and ice cream were a traditional pairing, and she refused to let anyone challenge it. And for 3 weeks, Claire slept deeply for the first time in months, and worked with James every morning and walked the garden in the afternoons with her hand on her stomach and talked to the baby and read her father's books and felt something settle that had been unsettled for a very long time. She thought she was safe. She was not. On the morning of the 22nd day after the funeral, her phone rang at 7:15. She was in the kitchen with her coffee, standing at the window that faced the garden, watching a light snow come down on the stone paths Thomas had laid himself over 3 weekends one autumn 15 years ago. Claire, James said, I need you to sit down. She sat. Ryan has retained Hendricks and Crow, he said. She knew the name. Everyone in New England legal circles knew the name. Hendricks and Crow were a matrimonial firm in Boston that operated with the specific, thorough aggression of a firm that had never been interested in settlement. They won because they made the cost of opposing them too high for most people to sustain. He is claiming marital property rights, James said. His argument is that certain assets you became entitled to during the marriage, specifically the inheritance, may be subject to equitable distribution under Vermont family law. Claire was quiet for a moment. James, she said. How did he know? A pause on the line. There was a brief item in the Vermont Business Digest 12 days ago, James said. The Hartwell Capital Partners succession. It was a small piece, barely 2 paragraphs, buried in the middle of the financial section. Most people would have scrolled past it, but someone did not. Ryan, we believe so. His filing came 6 days after the piece ran. Another pause. Claire, James said carefully, there is something else you need to know. As part of our standard due diligence in estate proceedings, we conduct an external records review on any parties who may have had potential knowledge of the estate. It is routine. We did this for Ryan. And 14 months ago, your husband retained a private financial research firm. The engagement lasted 3 months. The research directive was to investigate the Hartwell family name, to look for assets, holdings, any trace of significant private wealth connected to the name. The words arrived very clearly. He was looking, Claire said. Yes. Before your father was even diagnosed. Yes. Let that land. Because this changes the entire shape of what happened at that cemetery. Ryan Bennett did not abandon his 8 months pregnant wife in a February blizzard at her father's funeral because he had stopped loving her. He did not stumble into an affair with Amanda Fowler out of the ordinary human failure of impulse or loneliness or weakness. He had investigated his wife's family 14 months before the funeral, looking for money, when he found nothing. Because Thomas's structure was too solid to penetrate, he concluded there was nothing there. He pivoted to his exit plan. Amanda was the exit. The cruelty at the cemetery was the exit. He did not abandon Claire because he thought she was worthless. He abandoned her specifically because he had concluded she had nothing to offer him beyond what she already was. And then a 2-paragraph item in a business journal told him he had been wrong about everything. The man who hired the most aggressive divorce lawyers in New England before he finished his morning coffee was not a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had never, not for a single day, been the man Claire had married. He had been someone else the entire time. That is the hardest version of betrayal. Not the kind where someone changes, the kind where you discover they were always already this. What do we do? Claire said. We win, James said. The trust structure is solid. His argument has significant legal weaknesses. But it will take time and it will require the full attention of our legal team. Fine, she said. Let us begin. Ryan's legal team moved fast and with the specific confidence of people who are used to winning on resources alone. They filed an emergency motion to freeze certain estate assets pending the divorce proceedings. The kind of procedural motion that does not need to succeed to be effective. It needs only to create noise, to put Claire's name in print, to signal to the other side that this would be expensive and slow and thoroughly unpleasant. Claire spent 12-hour days working with James's legal team. She read every document. She asked every question she needed to ask and did not feel embarrassed about asking it twice if the answer was not clear. She had graduated third in her law school class and she understood legal procedure, and she applied that understanding now with a focus that surprised even James's senior partner, who had been doing this for 30 years and was accustomed to grieving. Overwhelmed clients. Not clients who read the opposition's motions the same day they were filed and called him with specific questions by 8 the next morning. She managed it. She kept her head. She moved through the days with the steady, low-burning resolve of someone who has found the thing they are fighting for and knows exactly what it is. And then the second blow arrived. James called on a Wednesday afternoon in early March. Claire was in the library, seated in one of the armchairs by the garden window, a stack of documents on the table beside her. "A petition has been filed in Burlington Probate Court," James said, "challenging the validity of the Hartwell Family Trust modification." She set down the document she was holding. "On what grounds?" "The petition alleges that your father lacked the legal mental capacity required to execute the trust modification at the time it was made, 12 years ago. That he was suffering from cognitive impairment that rendered him unable to fully understand what he was signing." "That is not true. We know. And we can prove it. But I need you to hear the next part." A pause. The petition names a co-petitioner. "Who?" "Patricia Bennett. She has retained independent legal counsel. Her filing is separate from Ryan's. 2 different attorneys, 2 different legal theories, filed in 2 different courts within 48 hours of each other." Claire stood up from the chair. "She filed it independently." "Yes. So he is attacking the estate in family court, and she is attacking it in probate court at the same time." "Yes. They are coming from 2 different angles simultaneously. That appears to be the strategy. Mother and son. One from family law, one from probate. 2 separate legal actions filed within 2 days of each other in 2 separate Vermont courts. The woman who had dropped the overnight bag in the cemetery gravel was now in probate court, claiming that the man being buried that day had not been of sound enough mind to decide who should inherit what he had built. The audacity of it was in its own way clarifying. Claire walked to the window. She looked at the garden. The snow was melting at the edges of the stone paths, and the first gray-green of early spring was pushing up along the south-facing wall, where Thomas had planted his first herbs every April for 20 years. There was a crow sitting on the garden bench. Not Thomas's bench, the garden bench near the kitchen door, perfectly still. She pressed both hands against her stomach. The baby kicked. One strong, deliberate kick, like a punctuation mark. And Claire did something she had not allowed herself to do since the parking lot. She cried. Not the controlled, managed kind. The full kind. The kind that comes up from the actual bottom of what you are feeling and does not stop to ask whether this is an appropriate moment. The kind that has nothing performative in it. No audience, no management. Just the complete and honest expression of a person being asked to carry more than any reasonable accounting of fairness would require. She stood at the library window with her hands on her stomach, and she cried until she was finished. James waited. He did not fill the silence with comfort that would have been empty. He had known Thomas Hartwell for 25 years, and he had watched this daughter from a distance for 25 years, and he understood that she was not a person who needed to be told that things would be fine. She was a person who needed to be given the space to feel what she felt, and then the information she needed to decide what to do. When she stopped, she pressed her hands flat against the glass of the window, and then she turned around. Her eyes were red. Her expression was steadier than it had been in months. "Tell me exactly what we need to do to win both cases," she said. "Not why is this happening. Not how could they. Not what did I do to deserve this. Tell me what I need to do to win." James opened his briefcase. "The probate challenge is actually weaker than Ryan's family law argument," he said. "Your father's medical records from the period of the trust modification are comprehensive. He had 3 independent cognitive assessments that year. All 3 are unambiguous. I have been keeping this documentation for 12 years, specifically in anticipation of a challenge of this type." Claire looked at him. "You anticipated this." "Your father anticipated it," James said quietly. "He told me 12 years ago when he executed the modification that whoever you married might one day try to claim what was yours, and that he intended to make it impossible for them to succeed. He spent 6 months with our legal team, specifically hardening the trust structure against exactly this kind of attack. James paused. He built the walls before you knew you needed them. She sat with that for a moment. Her father had done this when she was 20 years old. Before Ryan, before any husband, before any of it, he had sat in James's office and said, "Someone may try to take what belongs to my daughter, and I intend to make sure they cannot." And he had spent 6 months making sure. That is what love looks like when it thinks ahead. The probate challenge was defeated in 6 weeks. Thomas's medical records, 3 independent neurological assessments from the year of the trust modification, and 25 years of meticulous documentation by James Whitmore dismantled Patricia Bennett's petition completely. The judge dismissed it with prejudice, which is a legal phrase that means do not bring this back, and added a written note suggesting that petitioning counsel review the evidentiary standards for testamentary capacity challenges before filing in this court again. Ryan's equitable distribution argument was heard by a 3-judge panel for 38 minutes before being dismissed. Inherited assets structured in a properly executed irrevocable trust, the panel found, were not subject to equitable distribution in this state, regardless of when the inheritance was received. The legal team at Hendricks and Crowe had known this going in. They had filed anyway because filing cost them nothing and cost Claire time and money and energy. They would not be filing anything else. Claire exhaled. She called Sarah. Sarah drove up from Boston and they sat in the kitchen and Ruth made coffee and Sarah said, "Your father was the most prepared human being who has ever lived." And Claire laughed, a full real laugh, the first one in a long time. She thought it was over. She was almost right. Almost. It was a Thursday afternoon in late March when Claire's phone rang in the library. She was 38 weeks pregnant. She had been spending her afternoons in the armchair by the garden window, working through the documents James sent each morning. Organizing the structure of the Thomas Hartwell Foundation she was building in her father's name, a nonprofit dedicated to adult literacy programs across Vermont. Thomas had spent 14 years volunteering Tuesday evenings at the library. She intended to make sure that work lasted long past any single Tuesday evening. She had been feeling, for the first time in months, like herself. The version of herself she recognized from before the last 3 years. The person who had graduated 3rd in her class and taken the job she actually wanted and driven the 4 hours to Burlington every Friday because her father was the most important person in her life. The person who had never actually gone anywhere, who had simply been misidentified as someone else for a while. She felt the shape of the future and it was not frightening anymore. Her phone rang. James. Something in the quality of the silence before he spoke made her set down the document she was holding.
"Claire," he said.
"Ryan has filed an emergency petition in family court." She was still. "He is requesting an emergency determination of parental fitness," James said. "His argument is that you are emotionally unstable and unfit to parent. His specific language is extreme psychological instability stemming from prolonged grief and ongoing contentious legal proceedings. He has submitted a sworn affidavit from a clinical psychologist who has never met you, based solely on court filings and your public social media. A man had just called his 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant wife emotionally unstable in family court. A man who had attended his father-in-law's funeral with his girlfriend. A man whose mother had thrown his pregnant wife's bag onto cemetery gravel. That man had now filed in family court claiming his wife was unfit to parent their unborn child. Claire stood up. She felt a sharp, spreading pressure across her lower back, then through her abdomen. Then a sensation she did not immediately identify until it did not stop and she understood exactly what it was. "James," she said, very quietly, "I need to call you back." "Claire, are you?" "I need to call you back." She hung up. She called 911. She tried to reach Sarah, who was into deposition. She left a message. She went to the front door and opened it, and sat on the front step in the March afternoon, which was cold but not February cold, and she waited for the ambulance with her hand pressed to her stomach and her phone in her other hand and her back against the doorframe. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. At Burlington Medical Center, in Labor Room 4 on the maternity floor. Claire was 3 centimeters dilated and working through contractions with the focused, breathing-based methodology Dr. Catherine Walsh had walked her through at every prenatal appointment for the last 8 months. Dr. Walsh was 60 years old, had been delivering babies in Vermont for 32 years, and had the particular calm of someone for whom a crisis is simply a situation with a higher degree of difficulty that requires the same quality of attention as everything else. The first hour went as planned. Then the door to the labor room opened. The man who entered was not a doctor or a nurse or a technician. He wore a dark jacket and carried a clipboard and had the particular expression of someone executing a task they do not enjoy but intend to complete. He was a process server. He crossed to Claire's bed. He placed a legal document in her hand. Between contractions, Ryan Bennett had filed an emergency motion in family court requesting the right to be present at the birth, citing parental rights, citing his pending petition regarding parental fitness, citing the jurisdiction of the family court over the birth of a child whose custody status was under active legal review. Claire held the document. She looked at the door, through the glass panel in the door. For just a moment before a nurse moved to block the view, she saw Ryan in the hallway, in his good overcoat, with a man in a suit beside him who was not a doctor. At the labor room, a nurse was speaking. Dr. Walsh had turned from the monitoring equipment and was looking at the process server with an expression the night shift nurse would describe the next morning as the quietest fury she had ever seen on a physician's face. Claire looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the nurse standing near the door. She said, calmly and clearly, with a contraction building, "There is a phone on the table beside the bed. James Whitmore's number is in my recent calls. Please call him and tell him I need an emergency family court judge on the line within 15 minutes. The nurse stared at her. "Mrs. Bennett, you are in active labor." "I know," Claire said. "Please make the call." What happened in the next 90 minutes was later described by James as the most concentrated 45 minutes of legal work of his entire career. He reached the on-call family court judge at her home at 6:15 in the evening. He presented the complete documentation, the history of Ryan's legal conduct, the pattern of harassment, the probate challenge filed by Patricia, the equitable distribution argument already dismissed, the process server in a labor room, the footage from the Burlington Estate security camera of Ryan parked outside the gate for 4 hours on 5 separate occasions, the complete and documented pattern of a man using the legal system as a tool of ongoing intimidation against a woman in active labor. The judge, who had been on the bench for 19 years and had raised 2 daughters of her own and did not need to be told what this looked like, issued an emergency protective order from her kitchen table. At 7:02 in the evening, Ryan Bennett and his attorney were escorted from Burlington Medical Center by 2 hospital security officers. Sarah arrived at 7:40, having driven directly from Boston in her deposition clothes, with her briefcase still in the back seat. And she came through the door of labor room 4 slightly out of breath and grabbed Claire's hand and said, I am here, I am not leaving." And Claire said, "Good, stay." At 11:48 in the evening, after 7 hours of labor, with Dr. Catherine Walsh and 2 nurses and Sarah in the room, Claire Hartwell Bennett gave birth to a daughter, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, 19 inches long, a full head of dark hair and the ancient, unimpressed expression that newborns have, as if they have seen many worlds and are reserving judgment on this one. They placed her on Claire's chest. She was warm and impossibly real, and she was here. Claire held her daughter for a long, quiet moment. She felt the weight of her, the specific miraculous weight of a person who had not existed before and now did and was here and was hers. She pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head, and she said softly to the baby, to her father, to whoever was listening in the quiet of that room after all of it, "Hi, sweetheart, we did it, we won." Sarah, who was not a crier, cried. Ruth, the housekeeper, who had driven herself to the hospital and was sitting in the waiting room with a thermos of tea she had brought from the Burlington house, because she could not sit at home, put her hand over her mouth in the waiting room when James came out to tell her. And she said, "What did she name her?" And James said, "Rose," and Ruth said, "Of course she did." Because Thomas had always kept roses along the south-facing garden wall, and everyone who knew him knew why. Rose Hartwell Bennett, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, named for her grandfather's garden. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in July, 5 months after the cemetery and 4 months after the hospital. It took less time than the legal challenges that preceded it, because by the time the divorce proceedings began in earnest, Ryan's legal team had exhausted every available angle and had nothing left to argue. The Hartwell family trust was impenetrable. The probate challenge had been dismissed with prejudice. The equitable distribution argument had been rejected by a 3-judge panel. The family court had issued a permanent protective order based on the pattern of harassment documented during the months of litigation. Ryan received nothing from the estate. He was granted supervised visitation with Rose, 2 hours on Saturday mornings at a court-monitored family center in Burlington. The family court judge, in her written decision on the custody and visitation arrangement, noted, and these are her words, that the documentation presented by the petitioner's own prior legal filings raised significant concerns about the respondent's judgment, emotional regulation, and fundamental understanding of a child's best interests. She used the word significant twice. Patricia Bennett received a formal cease and desist from James Whitmore's firm in August. It documented the pattern of harassment, the probate petition filed in bad faith, and the specific conduct at the cemetery. It outlined the legal consequences of any further contact. Patricia received the letter on a Monday and did not contact Claire again. Amanda Fowler had ended her involvement with Ryan before the divorce was even filed. She had done this with the efficiency of someone for whom endings are simple, because no real attachment was made in the first place. She blocked Ryan's phone number and moved to Philadelphia, where she had a friend with a firm and a better social landscape than Boston. She did not leave a note. She did not explain herself. She simply moved to the next chapter because for someone like Amanda, chapters end when they stop being useful, not when the feelings are finished, because the feelings had never really been the point. Ryan moved back to Ridgefield, Connecticut, the town he had spent his entire adult life trying to leave behind. He took a position at a smaller firm, the kind of firm whose name does not appear on the buildings where the important people work. He stopped attending the events where he used to scan the room for the most important person present. He became gradually and without ceremony the person he had always been before the performance, an ordinarily ambitious man who had told himself an extraordinary story for so long he had forgotten the difference. He paid his child support on time. He showed up for his Saturday visits. He held Rose carefully and fed her carefully and learned, in the small quiet hours of those Saturday mornings in the family center, something about fatherhood that he had not known how to access before. It would take him years to understand it fully, but it was beginning. Claire did not speak publicly about any of it. Not once, not in an interview, not on social media, not to the journalists who parked near the Burlington estate gate for 6 weeks hoping for a statement, a quote, a sentence to turn into a headline. She gave them nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood, in the way her father had always understood, that some things do not need your words. They just need your silence, and your silence to be doing something which hers was. She established the Thomas Hartwell Foundation in September. The mission was adult literacy programs across Vermont, funding classroom space materials, trained instructors, programs at libraries and community centers and correctional facilities across the state. The first grant cycle funded 11 programs. By the following year, there were 23. James Whitmore joined the board. Ruth from the House joined the volunteer committee. Sarah Caldwell took the foundation's first major pro bono legal case. It was exactly what Thomas would have wanted. The exact shape of what he would have done with money given the chance to do exactly what he wanted with it. Claire moved into the Burlington house properly. She brought her books and her cases and her work, and she decorated Rose's room with things that were cheerful without being loud, the way Thomas had always preferred his environments. She hired a nurse for the first 3 months, and then discovered she did not need her as much as she had thought she would, because it turned out she was good at this, genuinely good. The way you are good at the things that feel like the truest version of what you are. She worked every morning. She walked the garden every afternoon with Rose in the carrier against her chest. She called Sarah every Thursday evening. She had James for tea on the porch every week through the summer. And on a quiet Saturday morning in the middle of June, when the Vermont summer was finally doing what Vermont summers do in June, all light and green and unhurried warmth, Claire carried Rose out through the kitchen door and into the garden. The garden was Thomas's garden. 29 years of tending and adjusting and planting new things and replacing what had not worked and keeping what had. Stone paths laid over 2 weekends one October, now settled into the ground as if they had always been there. Rose bushes along the south wall, the ones Thomas had watered himself every Sunday morning for 15 years, now full and open in the June warmth. An herb garden near the kitchen door, a long lawn that ran south toward the tree line. Mown in the careful parallel lines Walter the groundskeeper considered a professional obligation. Claire followed the stone path through the garden the way she had been learning its routes for the past 5 months. The path that wound past the fountain James had told her. Thomas installed the summer Claire graduated law school, celebrating privately and alone because he was that kind of man, past the rose wall, past the old apple tree at the corner. The path ended at a wooden bench beneath the oldest oak tree on the property. Thomas had sat on this bench every evening when he came to the Burlington house, which he had done alone, without telling anyone, for 22 years. He would sit on this bench after the walk through the garden and watch the light change in the oak leaves and think whatever he thought about when he was here. In this place he had built, in this life he had lived with such intention and such patience and such absolute, unfailing love. There were 2 letters carved into the arm of the bench, T&H Thomas Hartwell, cut into the wood with a small carving tool, neat and deliberate. The letters were worn smooth now, worn by years of his hand resting in the same place, the particular way a river wears a stone without ever intending to, simply by passing over it faithfully and consistently over a very long time. Claire sat down. She settled Rose on her lap, Rose, who was 4 months old and had learned in the last 2 weeks to focus her eyes with genuine intention. looked up at the oak leaves overhead with the concentrated wonder of someone encountering leaves for what was. In the most literal sense, the first time, the light coming through the leaves moved and shifted, and Rose tracked it with absolute seriousness, as if this was the most important thing currently happening in the world. She was not wrong. Claire placed her hand over the carved letters, over the T and the H worn smooth by 30 years of her father sitting in this exact spot. She closed her eyes. She felt the June warmth on her face. She heard the fountain in the garden behind her. She heard the birds that were settling in the oak above, the sound they make in the evening in Vermont, the sound of the end of a day that is going to be fine. She whispered to her father, to the bench, to the garden he had built long before she knew it existed. I opened it, Daddy. You were right about all of it. She sat there as the morning light moved through the leaves. Rose fell asleep. The garden was very quiet, and it was exactly entirely, completely enough. Now I want to speak to you directly, not about Claire, about you, because it would be easy to hear this story and think, she got lucky. She had a father who built $4 billion in secret. Most of us do not have that, and you are right. Most of us do not have a $4.2 billion trust fund waiting at the end of our hardest year. But that is not what this story is actually about. Here is what this story is about. The first thing worth taking with you is this. Silence is not surrender. It only looks like surrender from the outside. Claire was quiet for 3 years inside a marriage that was dismantling her piece by piece. A lot of people hearing this will want to ask why she did not leave sooner, why she did not fight back, why she absorbed what she absorbed for as long as she did. Because she was learning. She was learning who Ryan was, completely and without performance, so that when the moment came, she would have total clarity, no second guessing, no wondering if she had been wrong. She let the situation finish showing her what it was before she responded to what it had shown her. There is a difference between being silenced and choosing silence. One is done to you, one is a strategy. It is worth knowing which one you are doing at any given moment. It is worth asking yourself, honestly, which one this is. The second thing is this. What you are raised to believe about yourself will outlast everything anyone later tries to convince you that you are not. Ryan spent 3 years telling Claire she had no value. His mother repeated it. Amanda Fowler's presence was designed to confirm it. None of it worked. It could not work. Because you cannot erase 28 years of you are worth everything, with 3 years of you are nothing. Identity built on real foundations, on character and earned confidence and consistent love, does not dissolve under pressure. It goes quiet sometimes, but it does not dissolve. If you are watching this and someone in your life has been working systematically to make you feel smaller than you are, I want you to hear this clearly. The only reason someone needs you to be smaller is because your actual size is more than they can manage. The third thing, the people who truly love you already know who you are. They knew before the promotion, before the title, before the world confirmed it, before anything was proven or validated or announced. Thomas Hartwell did not need a business journal to tell him Claire was extraordinary. He had known since she was 19 years old and reached for an envelope and trusted, without needing to understand everything, that her father had reasons. The people in your life who only show up once the world validates you, those are audience members. Stop giving audience members the access that belongs to family. The fourth thing, your protection may already be built. Thomas built those legal walls 12 years before Claire knew she would need them. He structured the trust and documented everything and prepared James Whitmore in advance for what eventually happened. And a lot of us move through our lives feeling completely unprotected, like we are one crisis away from having nothing left. But some of us have people who have been quickly building things for us that we have not yet noticed. Pay attention to who shows up consistently, without drama, without needing credit. Pay attention to who does things for you before you ask, before the crisis, before you even know a crisis is coming. Those are your Thomas Hartwells. Hold them carefully. And if you are a parent, this one is for you specifically. Build the walls now, not just the financial walls, the walls of consistent love, of daily integrity, of showing your children, through the way you actually live and move and treat people every day, not through speeches, what a person of genuine value looks like. Because the greatest inheritance you will ever leave is not in any legal document. It is in the way your child talks to themselves when no one is watching. It is in the story they tell themselves about who they are at 2 in the morning, when everything is hard and there is no one around to confirm it. That story is what you write for them while they are growing up. Make it a true one. The fifth thing, and this is the last one. The ending of a hard chapter is not the last day of pain. It is the first day of clarity. Claire did not win when Ryan drove away from that cemetery. She did not win when the estate was confirmed or the divorce finalized or the judge dismissed the last petition. She won on a Saturday morning in June, sitting on her father's bench with her daughter asleep in her arms and her hand resting on the letters worn smooth by 30 years of a man who loved her enough to build everything she would ever need long before she knew she needed it. She won when the life around her finally matched the person she had always been inside it. That moment is coming for you too. I cannot tell you when. I cannot tell you what it will look like when it arrives. I only know that the version of you that has always been there, the one that certain people have worked very hard to convince you does not exist or does not matter or is not enough, that person is still there. They have not gone anywhere. And they are building things too. If something in this story reached you, if there was a moment that made you stop, the parking lot, the library, the hospital room, the bench in June, I would love for you to tell me which one in the comments below. Because the people who answer that question honestly are your people. They are watching this for exactly the same reason you are. And sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is say out loud, "That one got me. I felt that. I have been in some version of that." If you know someone in the middle of their own cemetery parking lot right now, someone standing in the cold while a car drives away, share this with them. Not because it solves anything, but because sometimes what a person in the cold most needs to know is that someone else stood in that exact same cold and did not fall apart, and built something from it and sat in a June garden with everything that mattered and felt, finally, like they were home. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I will be here every week with another one. If you or someone you know is experiencing emotional abuse or coercive control in a relationship, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The number is 1-800-799-7233. You are not alone. Help is available. He built the walls before she knew she needed them. That is what love looks like when it plans ahead. From Thomas Hartwell's final letter, open too late and exactly on time. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.